April 1944, northern Burma. A British brigadier named Michael Calvert stands on a hilltop inside a jungle fortress that should not exist. Around the perimeter, hundreds of Japanese soldiers lie dead in the barbed wire, their bodies bloated and rotting under the tropical sun. Flies swarm in clouds so thick you can hear them from 100 yards away. The stench is unbearable, and draped across the trees above everything, like some awful decoration, hang dozens of white silk parachutes from the supply drops that keep this place alive. That is how it got its name, White City, a fortress built 150 miles behind Japanese lines, sitting directly on the railway and road that feed the entire Japanese northern front. Every day it stays standing. Japanese divisions go hungry. Every day it holds. The war tips a little further toward the Allies. The Japanese have thrown an entire brigade at these defenses and failed. They have sent 27 bombers overhead and lost 12 of them. They have launched night assaults with bayonets fixed and Bangalore torpedoes strapped to their chests, and every single one of those torpedoes malfunctioned. The wire held, the Gurkhas held, the Lancashire Fusiliers held, and the dead kept piling up. But the story of how a few thousand British, Gurkha, and West African soldiers ended up building a fortress in the middle of Japanese-occupied jungle, supplied entirely by air, fighting off a force that outnumbered them, all while their commanding general lay dead on a hillside 400 miles away. That story starts 2 years earlier with the longest retreat in British military history. In January 1942, the Japanese army invaded Burma. By early March, they had captured the capital, Rangoon, and within weeks, they had driven the entire British force out of the country in what historians would call the longest retreat in British military history. 1,000 miles on foot, from Rangoon to the Indian border, through jungle, across rivers, under constant Japanese pursuit. The troops that staggered into India were wrecked, sick with malaria, half-starved, beaten in every engagement they had fought. Equipment was abandoned along the trails, morale collapsed. The prevailing belief across the British and Indian armies was that the Japanese soldier was simply better at this kind of war, more comfortable in the jungle, more willing to suffer, more aggressive in close combat. Nobody knew how to fix that. One British officer refused to accept it. His name was Orde Wingate, and he was, depending on who you asked, either a military genius or a dangerous eccentric. He had a track record of unconventional warfare going back to Palestine in the 1930s, where he organized Jewish night patrols against Arab raids, and to Ethiopia, where he led a mixed force that retook Addis Ababa from the Italians. Wingate believed the way to fight the Japanese in Burma was not to meet them head-on along a conventional front line, but to go behind them, deep behind them. He proposed inserting specially trained brigades into Japanese-held territory by foot and later by air, cutting their supply lines, destroying their railway bridges, and forcing them to divert troops away from the main battlefronts to deal with a threat in their own rear. He called these units long-range penetration groups. The soldiers called themselves Chindits, a rough Anglicization of Chintha, the mythical lion-dragon guardians that stand at the entrance of Burmese temples. Wingate got his first chance in February 1943 with Operation Longcloth. 3,000 men marched into Japanese-occupied Burma on foot, carrying everything on their backs and on mules, supplied only by airdrop. A Chindit carried a heavy pack, a small pack, and his weapons. The typical load was about 72 pounds, 80 if you were carrying a Bren gun. That is roughly half the body weight of the average soldier, and it only got heavier when the rain soaked through everything, which was most of the time. Northern Burma is one of the wettest regions on Earth. They cut the railway at several points and proved that British soldiers could survive and fight in the Burmese jungle. But the cost was severe. A third of the force never came back. Many of those who did return were so ravaged by disease, exhaustion, and malnutrition that they never served again. Critics pointed out that the damage to Japanese infrastructure was repaired within days and argued the whole operation was a waste of good troops. But Wingate had proven something that mattered more than any single railway bridge. He had proven the concept. British troops could operate behind Japanese lines for extended periods, supplied from the air, and the Japanese could not ignore them. That proof bought him a meeting with Winston Churchill and the full backing of the British government for a second, far larger expedition. This time, Wingate did not want hit-and-run raids. He wanted fortified strongholds, permanent positions built deep inside enemy territory, with their own airstrips, their own artillery, and their own garrison troops. Places the Japanese could not simply bypass. Places that would sit on the enemy's supply routes and choke them. The plan was called Operation Thursday, and it was approved in January 1944. The scale was staggering. 10,000 men would be inserted behind Japanese lines, not on foot this time, but by glider and transport aircraft. They would fly over the mountains at night, land in jungle clearings, and immediately begin building fortified bases. 3 landing zones were selected and given code names borrowed from famous streets. Piccadilly, after the road in London; Broadway, after the avenue in New York; and Chowringhee, after the main road in Calcutta. Each clearing had been scouted by aerial reconnaissance and chosen because it was remote enough to avoid Japanese patrols while flat enough to land gliders. On the evening of March 5, 1944, the operation launched. 80 gliders, loaded with troops, mules, and equipment, were towed by transport planes over mountains that rose 7,000 feet above the valleys below. The flight took hours, through darkness, over jungle terrain with no landmarks, and almost immediately, things started going wrong. Just before takeoff, a last-minute reconnaissance photograph of Piccadilly showed the clearing obstructed by logs. The British feared the Japanese had discovered the plan. In reality, it turned out later that Burmese teak loggers had placed the logs there to dry, a total coincidence. But the officers making the decision on the ground that night had no way of knowing. Piccadilly was scrubbed. All the gliders originally assigned there were diverted to Broadway. The result was chaos at Broadway. Too many gliders arriving at the same clearing. Some tow ropes snapped in flight. Some gliders came down in the wrong place entirely. Others crashed into the trees surrounding the landing zone. Ditches and ruts in the clearing wrecked several gliders on landing and blocked the strip for those coming behind them. Wreckage was everywhere. Men and mules scrambled in the darkness. It looked like a disaster. And then someone found a bulldozer. One of the crashed gliders had been carrying an American engineering bulldozer, and somehow the machine survived the wreck intact. American engineers got it running and began flattening the landing strip in the dark, shoving wrecked gliders aside, filling ditches, and grading the surface until transport planes could land. By the next day, C-47 Dakotas were touching down on the improvised runway, and over the following week, 600 sorties brought in 9,000 Chindits, along with more than 1,000 mules and tons of supplies and weapons. Broadway became a functioning airbase with defensive perimeters, anti-aircraft guns, and for a brief period, even Spitfire fighters parked along the strip. While Broadway was being secured, Brigadier Michael Calvert, the commander of the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, took 3 battalions and marched west toward the Railway Valley. His target was the railway and road near the town of Mawlu, the main supply artery, feeding Japanese divisions in northern Burma. If he could block that route, every Japanese unit fighting General Stilwell's Chinese-American forces to the north would start running short of ammunition, food, and reinforcements. On March 16th, Calvert's men reached the area around the village of Henu, near Mawlu, and began establishing a stronghold. But the site was not unoccupied. A Japanese force held a nearby rise called Pagoda Hill, and they had to be driven off before the position could be secured. The fighting was brutal, close-quarters combat in thick jungle heat. Lieutenant George Cairns of the South Staffordshire Regiment earned the first Victoria Cross awarded to a Chindit during this battle, fighting hand-to-hand with Japanese soldiers on the hillside. With Pagoda Hill taken, Calvert's engineers went to work. They built the position unlike anything the Chindits had attempted before. This was not a temporary camp or a hidden bivouac. This was a permanent fortress. The engineers laid dense belts of barbed wire around the entire perimeter, stacking it deep enough that a man could not get through it in a single rush. Behind the wire, they planted minefields and booby traps. They dug reinforced slit trenches and fighting positions with overlapping fields of fire. They positioned machine guns to create interlocking kill zones along every avenue of approach. A single company at White City was equipped with 16 light machine guns, 2 heavy machine guns, 2 mortars, and 4 flamethrowers. They set up Bofor's anti-aircraft guns to deal with Japanese air attacks. And when the Chindits overran a nearby Japanese supply dump, they captured Japanese 75mm artillery pieces and turned them around to use against their former owners. 2 airstrips were carved out of the ground alongside the railway, one for light aircraft used for casualty evacuation and one long enough for the C-47 Dakotas that brought in supplies and flew out wounded men. The South Staffords dug in along the north and east of the perimeter. The 3rd, 6th Gurkhas covered the south along a river and the west, overlooking the airstrips and the railway below. Calvert placed his headquarters on a hill in the center of the position. From that hilltop, you could see the railway running north toward Mawlu and the road running alongside it. Every train, every truck, every mule convoy that tried to use that route was now under the guns of White City. The block was working exactly as Wingate had designed it. Japanese divisions to the north, the ones fighting Stilwell's Chinese forces in the Hukong Valley, were being starved of supplies. Every day that White City stood, the Japanese northern front weakened, and then the supply drops began. Dakota after Dakota flew over the position and kicked out pallets attached to parachutes. Ammunition crates, rations, medical supplies, mortar rounds, all of it floating down under white silk canopies. Most of the supplies landed inside the perimeter or close enough to retrieve, but plenty of parachutes caught in the trees, and within days, the canopy above White City was draped in white silk. The jungle around the fortress looked like it had been decorated for some strange outdoor wedding. The name stuck immediately: White City. 8 days after White City was established, on March 24, 1944, Orde Wingate boarded a B-25 Mitchell bomber at Broadway. He had been visiting his forward strongholds, inspecting the positions at White City and Aberdeen before flying to Imphal to meet with Air Marshal Baldwin. On the return flight to his headquarters at Lalahat, something went wrong. The pilot had earlier complained about one of the bomber's twin engines not developing full power, but after discussion with Wingate, they decided to take off anyway. The plane crashed into a hillside in the jungle near Bishanpur, in what is now the state of Manipur, in northeast India. Everyone on board was killed, including several war correspondents. The crash was so violent that virtually none of Wingate's remains were found. The news hit the Chindits like a physical blow. Calvert's reaction, passed along through the ranks, became famous. "Who will look after us now?" he asked. Churchill later eulogized Wingate before the House of Commons, calling him a man of genius who might well have become also a man of destiny. Admiral Lord Mountbatten, the supreme Allied commander in Southeast Asia, issued an order of the day declaring that Wingate had been killed in the hour of his triumph. But the immediate problem was not mourning. It was who would replace him. The answer was Brigadier Joe Lentine, one of the Chindit Brigade commanders, a man known more for caution than for Wingate's visionary aggression. Lentine had actually doubted many of Wingate's ideas, and his appointment was opposed by several Chindit field commanders who felt he did not understand the doctrine. The change in leadership would have consequences that played out over the following weeks, and White City was at the center of those consequences. Meanwhile, the Japanese Burma Area Army was organizing its response. It had taken them roughly 2 weeks to react in force to the Chindit landings. But when the reaction came, it was serious. Major General Yoshihide Hayashi's 24th Independent Mixed Brigade was pulled from its garrison duties in southern Burma, where it had been guarding against a possible British seaborne landing, and ordered north at full speed toward Mawlu. The 24th was a numerically strong formation, and it had been reinforced with additional infantry battalions for the attack. Other Japanese units converged on the area from multiple directions. Roughly 20,000 Japanese troops were massing in the indoor Mawlu area. On April 6th, the Japanese struck White City. The assault opened with a heavy artillery bombardment that shook the ground inside the perimeter, sending dirt and debris spraying over the trenches. When the shelling paused, Hayashi sent 3 infantry battalions forward: the 2nd Battalion of the 29th Regiment, the 139th Independent Battalion, and the 1st Battalion of the 4th Regiment. Their objective was the southeast perimeter, defended by the Lancashire Fusiliers, the Gurkhas, and a small advance contingent of West African soldiers from the 7th Nigeria Regiment. The defenders were dug in behind rows of machine guns with mortars stacked behind them. When the Japanese infantry emerged from the tree line, the Chindits opened fire. Tracers stitched bright lines through the darkness. Mortar rounds dropped among the advancing troops. The Japanese took terrible casualties, but kept coming, wave after wave, pushing into the wire. Determined groups brought up Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes packed with explosive, designed to blow gaps in the barbed wire. Every single one of them malfunctioned. The wire held, and the bodies began to pile up against it. The next day, April 7th, the Japanese Air Force joined the attack. 27 medium bombers appeared over White City and began dropping their loads on the perimeter. The bombs blew holes in sections of the wire, but the Bofor's anti-aircraft guns inside the stronghold opened up and hit the bombers hard, shooting down 6 confirmed and claiming another 6 probables from that single raid. At dawn, Calvert called in close air support, and 6 P-51 Mustang fighters arrived, bombing and strafing the Japanese assembly areas parallel to the Chindit lines. The attacks continued into April 8th, but each assault followed the same pattern: a bombardment, then a charge into the wire, then devastating fire from the defenders. Captain Bill Towill of the 3rd 9th Gurkhas later described what the aftermath looked like. The bodies lay bloated, rotting, and stinking, covered with clouds of gorged flies, completely unreachable for burial. Attempts to burn them with flamethrowers only replaced one terrible stench with another. The scene around the perimeter of White City had become something out of a nightmare. Hundreds of corpses hanging in the wire or sprawled in the minefields in the tropical heat. And yet the fortress held. Every attack was repulsed. The wire, the machine guns, the interlocking fields of fire, the mines, the Gurkhas with their kukris, the Lancashire Fusiliers with their bayonets, all of it held. Inside the perimeter, life settled into a grim routine. During the day, the Dakotas came in for supply runs, flying low over the position and kicking out pallets. At night, the men waited in their trenches for the next assault. They ate rations that arrived by parachute, bread that came in tins and was sometimes blue with mold by the time it reached them. One veteran joked that at least if they got shot, they had already had their penicillin. They drank water from nearby streams when they could get it, and always, everywhere, the smell. The dead Japanese soldiers in the wire could not be reached for burial, and in the tropical heat, decomposition was fast and overwhelming. The Japanese commander Hayashi later described White City as a turtle-shaped fortification protected by 4-way artillery firing points and powerful wire entanglements. The Japanese official history recorded that their forces were no match for the enemy's air power, and that the enemy created circular defensive zones everywhere with concentrated fire that effectively encircled our troops. By mid-April, Calvert was ready to take the offensive. On April 10th, Lentane flew into White City and agreed to a plan that would hand the garrison over to Brigadier Gilmore's 3rd West African Brigade, freeing Calvert to lead floater columns outside the perimeter and attack the Japanese from their rear. Calvert assembled a strike force of roughly 2,400 troops, including his brigade headquarters, the 3rd 6th Gurkhas, the 7th Nigeria Regiment, the 45th Reconnaissance Regiment, with about 450 surviving soldiers and 1 additional column. Something else happened near White City in late April that quietly made military history. On April 21st, a light plane carrying 3 wounded Chindits and an American pilot went down about 15 miles west of the stronghold. No conventional aircraft could reach the crash site. Colonel Philip Cochrane of the 1st Air Commando Headquarters gave an order that had never been given before in combat: send the egg beater in. The Air Commando's only operational Sikorsky helicopter flew to a nearby airstrip, refueled, and made 4 separate trips to pull the stranded men out, one at a time, because the tiny helicopter could barely carry the pilot and a single passenger. It was the first helicopter combat rescue in history, and it happened within sight of White City. The counterattack was ferocious. On March 27th, weeks before the main Japanese assault, Calvert had already hit the town of Mawlu itself, attacking from 3 sides, burning out the Japanese garrison with flamethrowers and clearing the remaining strongpoints with kukri and bayonet. At least 50 Japanese died in that fight alone. Now, with his floater columns operating outside the wire, Calvert ambushed Japanese supply convoys, hit their forming up positions, and kept them off balance. On April 18th, he struck behind Hayashi's forces with the Reconnaissance Regiment and the Gurkhas, trying to pin the Japanese against White City's perimeter. Inside the stronghold, however, things nearly went wrong. On April 17th, Gilmore radioed Calvert that unless the Japanese were removed from the perimeter, it seemed likely White City would be breached. The message was sent without the knowledge of the 77th Brigade officers who remained inside the garrison. It was, in the estimation of Calvert and the senior Chindit leadership, an overreaction. Gilmore lost his command over it and was replaced by Colonel Abdi Ricketts, the second in command of the 3rd West African Brigade. The Japanese tried one more time. Attacks involving the 139th and 141st Independent Battalions and Captain Harada's 2nd Battalion of the 29th Regiment hit the perimeter again and again through mid-April. At dawn, on April 15th, Harada's men briefly captured a corner of the Chindit perimeter, the closest any Japanese force came to breaking into White City. They were pushed back. By April 19th, General Kawabe, the commander-in-chief of the Burma Area Army, who had spent the previous days fervently praying for continued progress of Hayashi's mission, wrote in his diary that the attack on Mawlu has failed. Hayashi withdrew his battered brigade south beyond Indore. By that point, more than 1,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead in the jungle around White City, caught in the wire, scattered in the minefields, or killed in Calvert's counterattacks. The fortress had held for 2 months against everything the Japanese could throw at it. And then the order came to abandon it. Lentine had decided to shift the Chindit operation northward, closer to Stilwell's Chinese-American forces. He ordered White City and Broadway abandoned in favor of a new stronghold called Blackpool, 60 miles to the north near Hopin. His reasoning was practical. The monsoon was coming, and the dirt airstrips at White City would turn to mud. The Chindit brigades were too spread out to support each other, and Lentine was already withdrawing several Chindit units from the field, which would leave White City isolated. Calvert was furious. He believed he could hold White City indefinitely. General Stilwell himself was against the decision, fearing that abandoning the block would allow Japanese reinforcements to move north unopposed. But Lentine insisted. On the night of May 9th and 10th, the 77th Brigade began pulling out of White City. Dakotas flew in under darkness to take out the 25-pounder artillery guns, the wounded, the remaining stores, and the mules. Before they left, the Chindits booby-trapped everything they could not carry. One veteran later recalled hearing explosions going off in the distance as the Japanese moved into the empty fortress behind them. White City had never been captured. In 2 months of fighting, the Japanese had thrown a reinforced brigade at its defenses and failed to breach them. They had bombed it from the air and been shot down. They had sent their best infantry into the wire at night with bayonets and explosives and been cut to pieces. The Chindits chose to leave. The Japanese did not push them out. The contrast with what followed made the decision sting even more. Blackpool, the replacement stronghold, was established on May 8th, just days before White City was evacuated. But Blackpool was sited much closer to the Japanese front line, where White City had been deep in the enemy's rear. The defenders at Blackpool had no time to build the kind of fortifications that had made White City so formidable. The Japanese attacked with troops supported by heavy artillery almost immediately. Within 3 weeks, the Japanese breached the perimeter, brought up anti-aircraft guns that made resupply impossible, and forced the Chindits to abandon Blackpool under desperate conditions. As Calvert and Stilwell had feared, abandoning White City released the Japanese 53rd Division to move north and attack. The story of White City raises a question that military historians still argue about. Was it worth it? The Chindits suffered terribly during Operation Thursday, not just at White City, but across all 6 brigades. Disease, exhaustion, and combat losses ground them down. After Wingate's death, they were misused and pushed beyond their limits. The 77th Brigade alone suffered 50% casualties in a single later battle at Mogaung. Wingate had planned for his men to be relieved after 90 days. Instead, they were kept in the field far longer, given tasks they were never trained for, and treated as conventional infantry by commanders who did not understand their doctrine. But what White City proved was that a small, well-fortified force, supplied entirely from the air, could sit on an enemy's supply line deep behind his front and hold it against everything he sent. The Japanese were forced to divert the equivalent of 2 divisions to deal with the Chindit threat, troops that could not be used against the main British forces at Imphal and Kohima, where the decisive battles of the Burma campaign were being fought. General Mutaguchi, the Japanese commander of the 15th Army, later suggested that without the Chindit diversion, he might have had enough strength to tip the balance in his favor at Imphal. The men who built and defended White City did not know any of that at the time. They knew the moldy bread that came in tins. They knew the stench of dead men rotting in barbed wire under the equatorial sun. They knew the sound of Japanese infantry screaming as they charged through the darkness. They knew what it was like to carry half their body weight through jungle with visibility of 30 feet, waiting for an ambush that could come from any direction. They knew the weight of a 72-pound pack on their backs, heavier when the monsoon rain soaked everything through. And they knew what it meant when the man who conceived the entire operation, the general who put them there and promised to bring them home, crashed into a hillside and never came back. When the last Chindit left Burma on August 27, 1944, the campaign was over. The cost had been enormous. Thousands of Chindits were dead, and thousands more would carry the physical and psychological scars of the jungle for the rest of their lives. But what happened at White City between March and May of that year remains one of the most remarkable defensive actions of the Second World War, and almost nobody outside of military history circles has heard of it. The Burma campaign was called the Forgotten War, even while it was being fought, overshadowed by the campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. The men who fought there knew it too. They called themselves the Forgotten Army. But what they built at Henu, near Mawlu, in the spring of 1944, a fortress out of wire and parachutes and raw stubbornness, surrounded on all sides by an enemy that could not break in, that deserves to be remembered. If this story was new to you, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me which forgotten battle you think deserves a video.